Welcome to Resilient Inspirations. Around here, we believe every story carries a lesson, and every question opens a new door. Think of this as friends talking over coffee, exploring ideas together. So let's get started, and I'll pass the mic to the conversation.
Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving into one of the most fundamental disagreements in the modern professional world, the myth of multitasking. Our source material, which is, built on solid cognitive science, argues pretty clearly that what we call multitasking is really just rapid and frankly inefficient context switching. This leads to a measurable switching cost that fragments our thinking. The path to real productivity, it insists, is through disciplined single focus and designing robust mental systems.
And look, no expert can really deny the science there. We know the limitations of working memory are very real, and the cumulative cost of constant interruptions, it genuinely harms our ability to think deeply. But I think the conversation often stops too quickly at just the scientific facts.
Exactly. So the central debate question for us today is this. Given the relentless digital and organizational pressures that professionals face, this culture of constant availability, rewarding urgency over importance, should the primary responsibility for achieving deep focus fall to the individual through, rigorous self-discipline and personal system design, or does the prevailing cultural environment make that expectation practically impossible and maybe even ethically unsustainable for the average professional?
And I'll be arguing that placing the entire burden of resisting systemic chaos onto the individual's shoulders is, it's an act of ethical avoidance. The work environment itself is actively designed to destroy focus, and I think that's where the ultimate responsibility has to lie. It's simply an unreasonable demand.
And I will argue that individual discipline and the strategic building of personal systems are not just optional best practices. They are the necessary, effective, and yes, ethically required path for any professional who is serious about high performance and long-term resilience. My position is fundamentally rooted in the idea of professional autonomy. The source material demands we move from passive resistance to one of active engagement. It's defined by acting with intention, not impulse. A high-level professional simply cannot afford to wait for their environment to quiet down. They have to actively engineer their own defense. This is why the material focuses so heavily on the tools for reclaiming your capacity, specifically designing systems that do the work for you.
Okay, but what does that actually look like in practice for our listeners?
Well, it's so much more than just a calendar block. It involves structured routines, automation, predictability. These are tools that eliminate the daily friction of minor decisions and lower the overall cognitive load. Think of a pilot using a detailed checklist before takeoff. They are a high-stakes professional who is relying on a system to ensure their cognitive resources are saved for only the most critical decisions. For any knowledge worker seeking to think deeper and work with clarity, this approach is frankly essential. It becomes a permanent skill set that stays for life. The professional imperative is personal. You have to safeguard your cognitive bandwidth from fragmentation. It's really the only way to maintain competence and avoid burnout through steady progress.
I understand the appeal of that kind of disciplined control. I really do. But I struggle with the idea that it's feasible for the majority of our audience. I fully accept that fragmented thinking genuinely harms performance. But the solutions often seem to ignore the systemic reality that the most hard to convince people face. I'm talking about the ones whose bonuses and promotions depend on appearing busy, reactive, and instantly available.
You believe they exist in a different reality?
In a way, yes, because their reality is defined by a cultural pressure where urgency has become the prevailing norm, overshadowing the significance of tasks. When you're immersed in a culture that treats inactivity with frailty and repose with inaptitude, where, not answering an email in 10 minutes is seen as a failure of professionalism. How can you responsibly implement daily rules for clear thinking, like batching reactive tasks, The systems you're describing are excellent for reducing internal friction, sure, but they do almost nothing to alleviate the external friction that is destroying focus in the first place. The expectation that an individual has to continuously employ this Herculean mental discipline just to survive in a chaotic environment places a profoundly unreasonable ethical burden on them, while letting organizations completely off the hook for addressing the root cause of all this digital noise and fragmented thinking. Let's go right to the core issue of feasibility, because this is where the theory, for me, really hits a wall. You advocate for systems that make decisions easier, touting routines and protected time. But the professional landscape is defined by the culture of constant availability. Our source material specifically notes that even a message marked quick question can end up consuming hours of your day. So how does an individual professional who's embedded in a team that depends on real-time collaboration realistically maintain their meticulous system when the environment driven by clients, colleagues, and just institutional inertia demands an immediate reactive speed that fundamentally contradicts the whole single focus rule?
I believe your analysis of feasibility overlooks the fundamental utility of a well-designed system. The professional isn't implementing this system to achieve total isolation. They're implementing it to achieve strategic control. The alternative you're suggesting, unstructured, reactive firefighting, that's not a path to success. That is a rapid descent into high hidden costs of switching, which degrades their decision-making and their reliability over time.
But they're rewarded for the firefighting, at least in the short term. The internal pressure to answer every single ping is immense. If a professional tries to implement that structure, say they batch their email until 11 a.m., and they miss a critical time-sensitive signal from a key stakeholder, their system hasn't given them clarity. It's created a professional liability. Doesn't that outcome lead directly to the guilt the source material identifies, that feeling of why we feel guilty slowing down? They just internalize the failure of the system when the environment was the true aggressor all along.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The goal is not to eliminate all reactivity. It is to shift the professional from an impulse response to an intentional response. The book teaches strategic multitasking. It's not a blanket prohibition. It's about combining low-load tasks with high-load tasks. For example, structuring an entire day's communication into 2 defined blocks. That's a system that manages 90% of the noise, freeing up the deep work hours. Furthermore, the system is meant to be adaptive. The source identifies specific, physiological red flags that mean stop immediately, like rising irritability or frequent mental static. These aren't failures of the system, they're built-in defense mechanisms, telling the professional their bandwidth is depleted. The system provides a mechanism to legally decline or defer, and crucially, provides the rationale for that choice.
But that requires the professional to have the social capital and organizational freedom to use their rationale. I mean, a senior partner or a CEO can define their own rules of engagement. A new hire in a high-pressure sales role where visible velocity is key risks their standing the moment they decide to organize their day around their clarity instead of the firm's perceived need for instant availability. We're asking the most vulnerable professionals to take the greatest personal risk to solve a systemic flaw created by leadership.
I have to disagree on the risk assessment. The greater risk is the long-term professional rot that comes from perpetually functioning at a suboptimal cognitive level. A system that defines where the boundaries are drawn is the only sustainable strategy for long-term competence, regardless of your role. And this leads us directly to the ethical dimension of the argument, which I believe firmly rests with the individual professional. Is it not an ethical imperative for any expert, any leader, or any knowledge worker, especially one whose output affects clients or patients or stakeholders, to prioritize protecting your cognitive bandwidth?
I accept the goal, but not the distribution of responsibility.
The source states clearly that fragmentation of focus has been shown to result in weaker decision-making. Imagine a consultant drafting a critical strategic proposal. but they're constantly switching between that complex analysis and, low-load tasks like scheduling meetings. This rapid context shifting inevitably compromises memory recall and judgment. So if that professional's constant reactive state leads to errors or substandard analysis, is the organization to blame for sending one email? Or is the individual responsible for failing to establish the mental and physical boundaries required to ensure the quality of their work? If their judgment is compromised, they are professionally compromised, and that affects everyone.
That's a powerful argument when you view it in isolation, but it overlooks the proportional responsibility here. We have to consider the emotional cost of demanding that level of sustained self-governance. The cultural environment is so intensely demanding that people genuinely experience discomfort when they attempt to decelerate. They feel anxious when they're not reacting.
That discomfort is a symptom, not an excuse.
It's a symptom that reveals the severity of the institutional problem. The issue is not some universal lack of willpower or mental discipline among professionals. It's that the external, technologically mediated systems and structures of modern life are actively destroying the capacity for focus. It's like asking a victim of chronic sleep deprivation to run a marathon and then blaming them when they fall short, completely ignoring the hostile environment. We are asking the professional whose mental energy is already depleted by digital noise to become an immediate master of deep work techniques, to find zen in the art of archery, just to function normally. This avoids the much larger collective ethical responsibility of organizational leaders to design environments that support rather than punish deep thought.
But the tools for change have to start with the individual, otherwise change never happens. If one leader successfully implements a short closing ritual or builds a focus-friendly workspace, it begins to redefine what competence looks like in their sphere of influence. The material provides a pathway for individual resilience that precedes the cultural shift. That individual commitment is the necessary precondition for the organizational outcome you desire.
I think that individual commitment is often just a highly effective coping mechanism used to endure a fundamentally unsustainable professional life. It ensures short-term survival rather than bringing about long-term cultural reform. So let's look at this through the lens of long-term career ambition. The source argues the key to sustaining high performance long-term relies on building a rhythm that lasts, which demands consistency over intensity. Yet the traditional path to visibility and conventional success, the quick promotions, the public praise, it often rewards visible intensity in the appearance of speed, what the book calls the illusion of efficiency.
You're describing short-term metrics.
I'm describing the reality of the professional hierarchy. For a professional who is skeptical, whose immediate bonus or next promotion depends on being the visible firefighter who is always on call and instantly responsive, why should they risk those short-term, measurable, and highly rewarding behaviors for the long-term, quiet promise of clarity and consistency? The systems you champion, the batching and the protected time, they're invisible. The appearance of speed is highly visible. The cost-benefit analysis often tilts against deep work until burnout forces the issue.
That is a powerful description of the current incentive structure. I'll grant you that, but it mistakes activity for achievement. The high-intensity reactive approach, as the source material repeatedly stresses, only has one destination: burnout. The material offers practical mechanisms for preventing burnout before it begins, precisely because that intensity is fleeting and ultimately corrosive.
But how do we prove that to the skeptical 20-something who just landed their dream job and has boundless energy?
We show them the accumulation of small advantages, consistency, even small daily acts of mental discipline, like aligning tasks with your peak energy hours or setting a brief opening ritual, allows progress to compound. It transforms chaos into direction. The firefighter eventually burns out, their judgment frayed. The disciplined thinker builds institutional knowledge and reliable judgment. The difference is longevity and the quality of your output. The book's final premise is crucial here. the capacity to think with strength will always remain timeless. You are not sacrificing short-term gain. You are protecting your long-term cognitive assets. The decision is ultimately between choosing depth over chaos, and that choice determines the quality and longevity of one's entire professional contribution, regardless of all the external noise.
This system is about professional resilience, not just time management. I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the systems are enough to counteract an entire corporate culture. I agree resilience is the goal, but to reach it, the professional first has to fight an upstream battle against systems that are actively engineered to break that very resilience.
The battle is inescapable. The only question is whether the professional enters that fight armed with intention and a system, or remains a passive victim of every single digital demand. So in summary, my position maintains that moving beyond multitasking requires an individual adoption of rigorous self-governance, strategic systems, and disciplined clarity. This personal commitment is, to me, the indispensable foundation for ensuring high-quality professional output and building long-term cognitive resilience.
And I stand by the critique that while the mechanics of single focus are critical, and the personal systems described are valuable tools, the culture of perpetual activity creates a context where the individual must first overcome intense, system-generated friction simply to even begin deep work. Until organizations acknowledge their role in designing these chaotic environments, the heavy cognitive and ethical cost of this fragmentation remains unfairly borne by the individual. And that just underscores a desperate need for broader cultural shifts alongside any personal discipline.
We converge clearly on the fact that relentless switching is detrimental to competence, and that intellectual clarity is the ultimate goal for effective professional performance.
Indeed, the pursuit of mastery requires not just understanding the tools of focus described in the material, but also recognizing the complex human and professional costs, both the internal fatigue and the external career friction, of striving for depth in a world that is fundamentally designed to reward and perpetuate distraction. We leave the listener to weigh the scale of individual responsibility against the resistance of the modern always-on environment.
That wraps up today's journey. Thanks to my friends for sharing their thoughts, and to you for being part of this circle. Remember, inspiration isn't found once, it's built every day in small choices. If this talk spoke to you, share it, follow along, and let's keep the conversation alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay inspired.